Big stories, short time. Welcome to Story in Shorts 01.
A strange portal rips open on a football pitch, sending players scrambling in all directions as soldiers march through. One soldier steps forward and announces they're from 2051, where humanity is losing a war against an alien species called the White Spikes.
In 11 months' time, all human beings in the future will be wiped from the face of the earth.
Now they need their parents and grandparents from the past to help them fight back. After all, what are adults for? 12 months later, several reporters discuss how new facilities were created to help destroy these aliens. The world government also sent 50% of the military into the future, but surprise, surprise, almost everyone died. Thanks to this, the government is forced to send civilian troops every week. But unfortunately, fewer people return every time. Several anti-war riots break out on the street as people wonder if their efforts are even worth it. Meanwhile, at a high school, students are more concerned with the tomorrow war than their class lessons. Although one of the students, Martin, is more intrigued by volcanoes.
Volcanoes are nature's fury, guys.
The others question the point in studying when the world is doomed, but Dan tells them that they've still got 30 years left.
We've seen the new number projections. We lose, period. The aliens kill us all.
Those are numbers from the year 2051. That's 30 years from now.
Too bad Star-Lord once had an entire universe and still fumbled the bag. Just then, Dan gets a text instructing him to visit a facility to confirm his drafting status, proof that karma has a cruel sense of humor. Reluctantly, he heads to the nearest facility, where they run some tests on him against his will.
What is this test? What are you testing?
The officials then drop a grim revelation. He's been selected for the draft because he's destined to die in 7 years.
It says that I die in 7 years? How do I die?
They suddenly slap a device onto his arm, sending jolts of searing pain through his body. After they're done, they explain that the device is a jump band, facilitating his travel to and from the future, but there's a catch. It won't come off until his service is complete.
Jump band allows us to track you anywhere on Earth.
And if he tries to tamper with it or escape the draft, his wife or daughter will be forced to take his place. At home, Dan tells his wife, Emmy, who begs him not to go knowing what awaits him.
7 days, I'll survive. Pretty tough guy.
You're tough, the man who cries through every cold.
Later, his daughter, Muri, tearfully realizes he's been drafted after he tells her that he's going on a week-long trip. Dan promises to return, but Muri has seen enough movies to know that's exactly what Star-Lord said before handing Thanos the win. Later on, Dan arrives at the facility where recruits get a crash course in weapons and first aid before deployment. They also reveal that if their jump band detects that they're still alive, they'll return to Earth in 7 days. Dan soon meets Charlie, a scientist who talks a lot when he's nervous.
See, I don't get the criteria for, what goes in what states. They took my shorts, they left the jacket, which is clearly, fashion over function.
Charlie's running mouth doesn't sit well with everyone, especially Dorian, the guy standing behind them who tells him to be quiet.
All right, stop talking. Listen. Totally. Sorry, when I'm nervous, I talk, and I'm on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm like a 97 on the nervous scale. Maybe like a 98. You look like a murderer.
Later on, Charlie tells Dan that Dorian was one of the first people to go into the future, and this is his 3rd time going back. He also has a necklace made out of the fangs of one of the first White Spikes ever killed. Later on, the new recruits are gathered in a room where they're given more info on the kind of danger they're facing. Charlie points Dan's attention to the fact that most of the recruits are over 40 years old, while the soldiers from the future are relatively young. They both arrive at the conclusion that the soldiers from the future had probably not been born yet to prevent a paradox.
I think we're going to be best friends.
Later that evening, Dan spots Charlie sitting alone and approaches him. While they chat, Charlie reveals that his wife was one of the first troops sent out on this mission, but she never came back.
She got sent out in the first wave.
Right after Charlie asks about Dan's family, alarms start blaring and the recruits run out. Meanwhile, the soldiers inform them that it's not a drill. Sending civilians to battle without training them? How fantastic. Dan stops a lieutenant named Hart and asks her what is happening. She informs him that the last research facility in 2051 is under attack, and if they lose it, they lose the war. After they arrive at the portal room, the recruits are instructed to load their weapons, but Charlie has issues fixing it, so Dan puts him through.
Take that. Just flip it around like that.
Makes sense.
And that's your safety.
Charlie is shocked at how easily Dan loaded his gun, but Dan reveals that he's ex-military. Just then, the jump link is activated and people are sucked into the portal, but right when Dan gets sucked in, they encounter a problem with the landing coordinates. Luckily for Dan and the surviving recruits, they fall into a pool that cushions their fall, but others are not so lucky. Dan soon jumps out of the pool and joins the other survivors as they stare at Miami, or what remains of it. Meanwhile, Colonel Forrester, Dan's daughter in the future, asks some scientists to figure out what went wrong with the jump link. She sends a direct message to the research team and informs them that the white spikes have gained control over the city and they plan on consuming every living thing, but there's one last thing she needs them to do. She asks Dan to help rescue the research team, and Dan follows her orders, not knowing that he was just talking to his daughter. Soon after, Dan sends 2 agents, Nora and Colin, to survey the premises for any signs of the white spikes, but all they find are some burning cars. After they make sure that the coast is clear, the rest of the team follows. Dan gives his team tips on how to be better soldiers, but Dorian tells him that if he tries to save people, they'll only get eaten.
Try to save your friends, you're gonna get eaten. We're team not eaten.
Nora and Colin get scared at the thought of being eaten, but the team moves on to the research lab anyway. In the research lab, they find the dead bodies of the scientists dangling from the ceiling. Dan reports the situation to the colonel, who asks them to grab some biological samples from the lab. While Dan grabs the samples from the lab, Nora and Colin spot some white spikes coming and inform the rest of the team. Colonel Forrester then asks them to get themselves out of there because aircrafts will soon bomb the lab in a few minutes. How nice, thanks for the heads up, Colonel. He heads out with the rest of the team only to find Nora and Colin by the doorway. They tell him that he definitely doesn't want to go through that door, and with that, they make their way to a back stairwell in hopes of escaping the building and not turning into food for Spiky. As soon as they enter the stairwell, they hear strange noises indicating that the white spikes are somewhere around the corner. Nora and Colin spot them first, and they point the others' attention to it. Dan urges them to run for their lives while shooting at them. The team fights back while trying to escape with their heads intact. Unfortunately for them, the white spikes grab a couple of them and bite their heads off like their favorite piece of candy. Dan tries to fend off one of the aliens, but he ends up enraging it instead. Luckily for him, Dorian kills it and informs Dan that to kill a white spike, you have to aim for the neck or the belly. With only 3 minutes to evacuate before the airstrike, the team rushes to their transport, only to be ambushed by white spikes. Colonel Forrester tells them to run for their lives, but she warns them against entering the red zones. Too bad, because they run straight into one. The airstrike team soon starts bombing the areas where there's a large concentration of white spikes. Meanwhile, Dan and the others run for their lives while trying to avoid turning into flaming hot Cheetos, or worse, getting eaten by the white spikes. They climb down a fence and make their way to safer grounds. Unfortunately, Colin falls through a tunnel, which forces Dan to go after him. The rest of the team is forced to join him, but Nora gets shot by the spikes from one of the white spikes. Colin and Nora realize that they'll only slow down Dan and the rest of the team, so they beg Dan to leave them. Dan reluctantly leaves them while they shoot the rest of the white spikes. They manage to escape the area just before it blows up. The following day, Dan and Charlie are shocked when they wake up in a camp. Charlie wonders where the hell they are, but it turns out that they're just in a camp in the middle of nowhere. They then spot Dorian and instantly walk up to him. They ask about the others, but Dorian informs them that they're the only survivors. Dorian believes they should have left Colin and Nora to die instead of going back for them, but Dan tells him that the reason they fight is to save everyone. Dorian informs Dan that the only reason he's out here fighting is because he's got terminal cancer, a fate he learned of while being drafted, and rather than wait it out in the past, he prefers to die on his own terms.
I'd rather die here than a slow death back home.
Just then, 2 soldiers from the future inform Charlie and Dorian that they have to join the strike team. Charlie is scared because he doesn't even know how to handle a gun, but Dan promises him that he'll be fine. Well, as long as Star-Lord doesn't punch the alien at the worst possible moment to ruin everything. Dan walks over to the colonel and asks why he wasn't dispatched with the rest of the team. She thanks him for assisting her in securing the samples. Just then, a soldier from the future appears and addresses the colonel by her name. After she leaves, Dan questions her about her last name and is shocked to find out that she's his daughter, Murray. He tries to hug her, but she doesn't seem too eager for a family reunion. Dan wonders how she picked up an interest in the military, since he always thought she'd be a scientist. She informs him that she studied science and she even bagged a PhD in biotechnology.
Yeah, I have a PhD in biotechnology with an emphasis in genomics and immunology.
Dan tells her he's proud of her, but Maury informs Dan that their reunion is not the focus, as she had a significant purpose for bringing him there, which she will reveal at the appropriate time. Ouch! That must sting bad. Maury then leads Dan into a tent, where she informs him that they've created a toxin that can kill the male white spikes. Unfortunately, the toxin isn't effective on the females. The female white spikes are rarer but hard to kill, mostly because they're so strong, but also because they're heavily protected by the males. They then board a helicopter, where Colonel Forrester tells him that the game plan is to capture the female so they could bring it to the lab and figure out how to kill it. While they head towards a white spike nest, Maury informs Dan of how the white spikes seemingly appeared out of thin air. Apparently, they first appeared in Russia, and before the world knew what was happening, they had spread to all parts of the globe. Unfortunately, they're yet to discover a crash site for the spaceship that brought them to Earth. To make matters worse, these big buggers don't care about money or world power. They see humans as nothing but food and are very hungry. Dan then asks Maury how he died and what happened between them, but Maury's mood suddenly changes and she suggests that it would be better if they stop talking. They finally arrive at their destination, where a strike team is currently engaged in a fight with the female. The strike team asks for assistance with caging the female, and Maury takes some soldiers with her. They find the strike team already engaged with the female. Maury tries to save one of her soldiers, but she only makes the female more furious. The female then charges at her at full speed while Maury fends her off with her vest. That's like hitting a bull with a pencil, but somehow she manages to keep her off. After Dan hears that his daughter is in danger, he ignores her instructions to stay in the helicopter and joins them in the spike nest. Dan grabs the female by the tentacles and almost gets spiked by her. The other soldiers assist Dan in pulling the female white spike while she attempts to bite his head off. Colonel Forrester takes advantage of this and joins in the fight. They manage to capture the female in the cage, but unfortunately, the males notice that their queen has been captured, so they chase after them. They almost grab hold of one of the helicopters, but the soldiers make a sharp turn and smash the aliens into jelly. Maury, Dan, and the rest of the team shoot at the oncoming white spikes, but they're unable to board any of the helicopters before they fly off. As the white spikes close in on them, Dan and Maury are forced to escape in a Humvee, which Dan rides while Maury uses the machine gun. Somehow, they escape with their lives intact and head over to a beach before stepping out of the vehicle. Maury asks Dan why he ignored her instructions when she clearly needs him to remain alive. Dan says he couldn't just watch while his daughter was in danger. It's at this point that Maury decides to tell Dan the truth about his death. She informs him that he divorced her mom when she was 12, and he never came back into her life. 4 years later, he died in a car accident without making up with her mom. Maury holds back tears while telling him that she and her mom believed in him when no one else did, but he died without ever reuniting with them. Dan is left speechless and hurt by his daughter's revelations. Sometime later, they arrive at the Deep Swell facility in the Bahamas, where the captured white spike is sedated. Dan finds Maury in her laboratory, where she's working hard to create a toxin that can kill all the white spikes once and for all. She gets some biological samples from the sedated female and begins to test different combinations. As Dan and Maury work on finding the correct toxin combination, Dan asks Maury if he can help with anything, but she tells him it's a one-person job. Dan then steps out of the lab where he finds another soldier. He praises Maury for her efforts and how she never takes a break. He also reveals that the only reason why Maury is getting worked up is because one way or the other, the war is coming to an end. Later on, Dan visits Maury at the lab determined to help. He reminds her that she brought him here for a reason and pleads with her to tell him what he can do to help. Maury, after some hesitation, finally relents and tells him that the war is slipping through their fingers and there's not enough time or resources to mass produce the toxin. If all else fails, she wants Dan to take it back to his own time, produce it in bulk, and stop the war before it even begins.
I'm asking you to do what no one else is willing to do.
Dan refuses, but Maury tells him it's the only way. Just when she manages to convince him, the computer beeps, indicating that a toxin with a 100% bond has been discovered, and they now have the perfect weapon to wipe out the white spikes. But their breakthrough is short-lived. The female white spike awakens with a deafening screech, and an agent sends out terrible news. The white spikes have breached the perimeter and are charging in to rescue the female. As several white spikes close in on the lab, Dan suggests using the toxin to kill the female while they still can. But Maury insists that this toxin is their best chance at survival, and they need to preserve it. With time running out, they prepare to escape to the jump portal. Maury makes Dan promise he'll head straight for the chopper. But before they can even get close, the aliens manage to free the female, who wastes no time hunting down the people responsible for her captivity. And at the top of that list, Maury and Dan. Meanwhile, Dan and Maury fight their way toward the jump link portal. Unfortunately, the female catches up with them. They fire numerous shots at her until they finally land a critical hit on the female. She howls in pain, and they use the opportunity to make a break for it. While they make their way towards the jump link, the female finds them again, but this time she shoots one of her spikes at Maury. Dan quickly jumps down after his daughter and helps her up. Together, they make their way to the jump link. Meanwhile, the white spikes cause a lot of damage, even dragging down helicopters with them. Maury sits in exhaustion after losing a lot of blood. Dan tries to help her up, but she cries in pain. She urges Dan to leave with the last toxin and informs him that she's so glad she got to see him as the brave man that he once was.
We were never going to make it. I love you, Dad.
Just then, the female white spike shows up and tries to attack them. During the chaos, the floor collapses, and Dan jumps to save his daughter, only to find himself in 2022 due to the jump link. He wakes up injured, but informs Lieutenant Hart about the toxin Maury created, only to learn that they can't return to 2051 because the portal is now broken. Dan is now overcome with guilt for not saving his daughter, while Charlie is sad that he hid like a little bitch. Later, Dan and the rest of the recruits return to their families, who wait for them outside the facility's gates. Dan walks up to his wife, who hugs him with wide arms. After they arrive home, he finds Maury, who hugs him and tells him that she just knew he would make it back. Later that night, Dan tells his wife how he met Maury in the future, and she was a great scientist.
You're saying you literally physically saw our daughter?
He further reveals that they made the toxin together, and she wanted to save the world, but now he's got the toxin and they can't even use it. Emmy promises him that they'll figure it out together. She asks him how the white spikes first arrived. Perhaps they could destroy them before they ever get a chance to torture all of humanity. Dan tells her that the white spikes showed up in Russia in 2048, but no one knows exactly where they came from. When Emmy suggests that the aliens could have landed way earlier, Dan suddenly gets an idea. Dan heads over to a bar where he finds Dorian watching the news. Dan tells Dorian that they can still save the world, but Dorian tells him to stop trying so hard to be a hero. Dan tells him he's no hero, but if saving the world means saving his daughter, then he would gladly do it. Dorian is moved by this, and since he doesn't want to sound like a douche, he agrees to help.
What kind of selfish dick doesn't help a guy save his kid, right?
Dan then asks Dorian if he still has the white spike's claw, and Dorian shows it to him. They then visit Charlie, who analyzes the spike and finds traces of volcanic ash on the claw that originated either from China or Korea. Dan wonders how volcanic ash from China or Korea ended up in Russia, but Charlie tells them that they'll just have to ask a volcano expert about it. That's when Dan realizes that he actually knows a volcano expert. They head to Dan's biology class, where they question Martin, the volcano expert. They ask him how a creature from Russia ended up with ash from China or Korea on its claws. Martin explains that the ash likely originates from the Millennium eruption, which occurred in 946 AD on the border between China and Korea. The eruption was so powerful that its ash spread across the globe and remains buried deep in ice in certain locations.
Today you can still find that ash buried in ice.
Using a laptop, Martin discovers that a specific site in Russia still contains volcanic ash from that eruption, preserved beneath layers of ice.
To get ash in the claws, I mean, they would have to dig through 1,000 years of ice.
This leads them to a startling conclusion. The White Spike spaceship had been on Earth since 946 AD. Talk about a bad blast from the past. They then head over to the Air Force and ask for help with funding a secret mission to Russia, but their request gets turned down. Dorian suggests that they kill the White Spikes themselves, but Charlie reminds him that they don't have the resources to do so. Dan suddenly realizes that he knows someone with a helicopter that could get them to Russia. He then visits his father, James Forrester, and instantly asks for his help.
Wow, you know, they say kids never come by unless they need something.
His father is surprised to see him, but he agrees to help. On the day of the operation, Lieutenant Hart brings them boxes of the mass-produced toxin and wishes Dan good luck as they embark on their journey. Upon reaching their destination, their compass malfunctions due to a strong magnetic field, leading them to a large crack in the ice where the spaceship is located. Dan warns the team about the dangers of entering the cave and decides they must cut open the ship and release the toxin to eliminate the white spikes. Inside the ship, they discover dead alien bodies, realizing they are at a crash site and that the white spikes were intended as cargo.
When we're done with them, it'll be like they were never here at all.
They successfully kill some of the white spikes while they're asleep, but others start waking and rush towards the exit. The group then splits up in an attempt to kill the escaping white spikes, but Dan is reluctant to leave the cave. Dorian assures him that they'll handle things in the cave and gives Dan his white spike claw, telling him to go save his daughter. Meanwhile, Charlie finally manages to kill his first white spike while saving James. Ha! Good grief! After a while, the team in the cave realizes that they can't kill all the white spikes, so they decide to sacrifice their lives by blowing up the cave. Before blowing up the cave, Dorian screams that he's going to die in his own way and finally goes out with a bang. Dan is thrown back by the force of the explosion. His father runs over to him and tells him that one of the white spikes got away, and it's a big one, prompting Dan that it's probably the female. His father offers to help him track it down, and together they hop on snowmobiles and chase after it. Dan hops off his bike after seeing the footprints of the white spike. Not long after, the white spike realizes that some humans are nearby and attacks a figure, but it turns out to be just a scarecrow. James then fires shots at it from the top of the cliff.
Surprise, dumbass.
The female then starts running towards James while he shoots, but unfortunately for her, she gets kissed in the mouth by Dan and his motorbike. The duo then team up and shoot at it until it falls off the cliff. They're unable to detect its location, so they scan every side in hopes of finding the alien.
She's bleeding though.
Maybe she's down.
The white spike suddenly emerges out of nowhere and attacks them. It shoots a spike into Dan's leg and lunges at him. As it gets close, Dan stabs it with its spike while James manages to take out its eyes. She steps back in anger and roars as it blindly searches for its attackers. Dan lies dangerously close to the edge of the cliff while the white spike draws closer to the scent of Dan's blood. James then cuts his hand to save his son, catching the attention of the alien. James then bids Dan farewell, but suddenly Dan jumps on the creature and stabs it with Dorian's claw. Finally, he grabs another dose of the toxin, injects it straight into the bitch's mouth, and kicks it off the cliff, ridding humanity of the white spikes for good. Moments later, Dan collapses beside his father in exhaustion, and he's joined by Charlie, who suggests they all take a break. Meanwhile, the press release a statement on the volcanic eruption and how the very same threats they were scared of had now been eliminated. Dan soon returns home and hugs his family, after which he introduces Muri to her grandfather. Dan and his wife share a passionate kiss as he realizes that what he was looking for was always right in front of him. A family. And he had found one, and there's no way in hell he's ever leaving them. The future be damned.